Well, I agree with much that Professor Haggard has said about both the answered and unanswered questions regarding free agency and willing and conscious intention and so on. But coming at these problems as a philosopher, and by the way, when I talk to scientists about these matters, they sometimes say, well, we scientists discuss these issues in terms of, we're the ones who talk about what we know, you philosophers talk about what we don't know. And indeed, we have to be a bit more speculative. But coming at these problems as a philosopher, I'd like to step back first and place the new neuroscientific research that he discusses, and that also discussed by Professor Gazzaniga in his interesting opening address, in the context of centuries-old philosophical debates about free will and moral responsibility. The so-called problem of free will, on which the new research they discuss has an important bearing, is one of the oldest and most difficult problems in philosophy. And it's related to many important questions about who we are as human beings, to our place in nature, to morality, to crime and punishment, to blameworthiness and responsibility, coercion and control, and many other things. When introducing the traditional problem of free will, I think a good place to start is with a quote from the 13th century Persian poet and Sufi Muslim philosopher Jalaluddin Rumi. There is a disputation, Rumi said, that will continue till mankind is raised from the dead, between the necessitarians and the partisans of free will. This problem of free will, of which Rumi speaks, has arisen in history whenever humans have reached a higher stage of self-awareness about how their behavior may be influenced by factors previously unknown to them and beyond their control. These unknown factors have been varied. In ancient times, actions might be determined by fate, so that humans would have no ultimate say in the matter. Later, that all their actions might be preordained or predestined by God, which led persons to wonder whether they were responsible for what they did or could have done otherwise. In his classic poem, Paradise Lost, John Milton describes the angels themselves debating how some of them could have sinned of their own free wills, given that God had made them intelligent and happy. Why would they have done it? And why were they responsible for it rather than God, since God had made them the way they were and had complete foreknowledge of what they would do? While puzzling over these questions, even the angels, according to Milton, were in, quote-unquote, endless mazes lost. Not a comforting thought, I think, for us mortals who think about these things. Still later in the modern era, the threat shifted to the new physical, biological, and behavioral sciences, where all our actions, the results of physical causes, unknown to us and over which we had no control. Were they the products of unconscious and repressed psychological factors also unknown to us, or of genetic and social conditions over which we lacked control, and so on? It's not hard to see how new research in the neurosciences, such as that discussed by Professors Haggard and Gazzaniga, fits this historical pattern of debates about free will, to the degree that it suggests our choices and actions may be the result of neural processes of which we are not conscious and over which we may not have conscious control. Indeed, contemporary neuroscientific research presents one of the most powerful challenges, I think, in the long history of debates about free will. The challenges are especially significant today because there's also scientific evidence on the other side showing how important free will is to us. There is, for example, a growing body of research by psychologists suggesting that giving up a belief in free will would have significant moral psychological costs. Canadian psychologists Jonathan Schuller and Kathleen Voss, among others, have performed numerous experiments suggesting that doubts about free will have effects on moral behavior. Persons are more likely to cheat, abandoning moral responsibility to ambition, and many other things when doubts about free will arise. I have to clear my throat a little here. I think more research is needed to show these effects are genuine and long-lasting, but I think such research is important. For free will skepticism has had something of a resurgence in recent philosophy. The new free will skeptics argue that free will in the deep sense needed to ground genuine moral responsibility is an impossibility. These skeptics often like to quote Nietzsche, who said that the traditional idea of free will that would ground ultimate moral responsibility for our behavior is the greatest, quote unquote, self-contradiction ever conceived by the mind of man. Nietzsche always speaks strongly about just about anything. Some of these free will skeptics argue further that abandonment in belief in free will and ultimate responsibility, in the traditional sense, would not have dire effects on moral behavior or social mores, as one might suppose. Indeed, they say, ceasing to believe in free will would even have beneficial effects, making us less retributive and revengeful about criminals, more humane, and more into prevention and rehabilitation. Well, perhaps so, for some people. And heaven knows we need less knee-jerk retributive attitudes down where I come from in the Lone Star State. As a longtime member of the Texas and National Alliances for the Mentally Ill, I fought for more humane treatment of the mentally ill in the criminal justice system, who are often warehoused in prisons, and for young offenders whose neural development as regards practical reasoning we now know is far from complete. Yet, like many others, I've always been skeptical of the extreme claims of free will skeptics, who used to be called hard determinists, that abandonment of belief in free will and ultimate responsibility altogether would not have dire effects on moral behavior or social mores. Such skeptical views dangerously neglect, I think, the widespread human tendency to justify selfish and immoral behavior by rationalization, self-deception, and denial. And rejection of free will and ultimate moral responsibility is, to my mind, the ultimate incentive for rationalization, self-deception, and denial, as the psychological experiments of Vos, Schuller, and others suggest. We philosophers, in the spirit of Socrates, are supposed to be especially wary of rationalization, self-deception, and denial, and we should be especially wary of this one. One of my teachers in Vienna many years ago, Viktor Frankl, was a famous psychiatrist and existentialist thinker, had been in a Nazi concentration camp. I remember him saying once that America ought to build a Statue of Responsibility on the West Coast to balance the Statue of Liberty on the East Coast. An interesting thought, I think. With these thoughts about free will skepticism in mind, let me turn to the neuroscientific research on voluntary action and conscious willing that Patrick has discussed, and to which he's made important contributions. A number of philosophers and psychologists in recent times, whom he mentions, Harvard psychologist Daniel Wegner being prominent among them, have argued that conscious will is an illusion. Such views are an obvious threat to belief in free will and moral agency. And Wegner, as Patrick, I won't go through this in detail because Patrick's discussed it. Wegner bases some of his views on Libet's work and that of others on consciousness, that the initiation of voluntary action, that consciousness arrives hundreds of milliseconds too late to be the cause of initiation of voluntary action. Indeed, other researchers have observed that this much discussed time lag in voluntary action may be necessary because of the immense amount of information that must be processed for the relevant kind of conscious awareness. So Wegner and others argue that contrary to what we may think, action is initiated by unconscious processes, and our consciousness is merely a delayed observer of the scene, not the agent. What are we to make of this evidence and controversy as regards free will? As a philosopher, I come at this controversy by asking the following. What kind of a role for conscious will in action is required to ascribe responsibility, and in particular moral responsibility, to agents? For free will is tied intimately to the question about moral responsibility for action, and I think a study of the history of the whole debate about free will, which goes back centuries and centuries, would make that very clear. And I think what I have to say here is in agreement in part, I think, with much that Patrick has had to say. First, I think we must concede that much of what goes on when we engage in deliberation and voluntary action is indeed unconscious. Despite this, I believe one may rescue a role for the causal efficacy of conscious willing if one views it first as future-directed. This is a predictive element that Patrick was talking about. And second, as low resolution or indirect. That is, if one views consciousness as operating by modulating the mental environment, by influencing perceptual interpretation, and by increasing the probability that certain patterns of action already in the repertoire of the agent will be implemented. Many of these patterns then may be, in fact, implemented unconsciously. Indeed, I would suggest further that the efficacy of all willing, conscious and unconscious, and purposive activity generally is and must be both low resolution and future directed in this way. I venture to say that such low resolution control is not merely close enough to free will, as Peterson and Sharif, two Canadian psychologists, suggest, but is the essence of it. Conscious willing involves two things, purposiveness and control. And both purposiveness and control can be, and in my view inevitably are, low resolution and future directed. Consider deliberating about which of two courses of action to undertake. We are consciously aware of the overall goal or purpose of the deliberation, to decide between one of these courses of action, and this overall goal guides our deliberation. But we are not consciously aware of all the complex cognitive processing involved in the deliberation itself, the subroutines brought to bear, and so on. Nor need we be, any more than we have to be conscious of our own detailed events involved, say, in raising our arm or any other overt action. And when we do decide on one of the courses of action, we will consciously endorse that decision as the resolution of our deliberation. There may even be, I would concede, milliseconds of time lag between making the decision and the conscious awareness and endorsements of its having been made. Still, the role of consciousness at the end of the procedure will be as important for purposefulness and responsibility as consciousness was in the beginning in setting the agenda. For the conscious endorsement puts a stamp of approval, so to speak, on the outcome of the deliberation, indicating the agent's accepting it as his or her own resolution and taking responsibility for it. This is the other side of the coin of Libet's controversial veto role for consciousness that Patrick nicely described. Interestingly, it can also be shown in this way, I believe, that low resolution control is not only compatible with purposefulness, but also compatible with moral responsibility, even ultimate responsibility of the kind I think free will requires. Consider an assassin attempting to kill a prime minister with a high-powered rifle from a great distance. There are many factors over which the assassin has no control that influence whether he will succeed in attaining the goal. Wind and other factors affecting the trajectory at a long distance, whether the minister's aide moves in front of the prime minister at the last minute, whether a nervous tic will lead to a wavering of the assassin's arm. He's getting older, let us assume, and his nerves are not as steady as they once were. He's thinking of getting out of the business. And of course, there's much else going on in his nervous system as he readies himself and takes aim that he's not aware of and has no direct conscious control over. But let us suppose that despite all these factors over which he has no direct control, the assassin fires and does succeed in killing the prime minister. Is he responsible, morally and legally, for killing the prime minister? Assuming as we can that he's not deranged, acting compulsively or under coercion, or any of the other usual moral and legal excuses, the answer, I believe, is yes, if these other factors were absent. It would be a strange defense if his attorney argued in court that his client wasn't guilty of murder because his killing the prime minister depended on factors such as the wind, his nervous disorder, etc., of which his client was unaware and over which the client lacked control. This would make the so-called Twinkie defense look brilliant. But why? The reason is that despite all these unknown factors over which he lacked control, the assassin did consciously aim to kill the prime minister. Here we have conscious intention, of which Patrick spoke. And secondly, when he became aware that he had succeeded in doing so, he consciously endorsed that outcome as something he was trying and aiming to do all along. In other words, just as with the deliberation, consciousness came into play at both ends of the process. On the one hand, in setting and indirectly guiding the agenda about what he was aiming to do, and on the other, in consciously endorsing the successful completion of that agenda. Much of what went on in the carrying out of the agenda, however, though not necessarily all, may have been below the level of conscious awareness. I believe that philosophers in general who discuss free will have consistently underestimated the role of unconscious processes in the exercise of free will. Neuroscientists have taught us otherwise. Conscious willing must be involved to some degree in free and responsible action, but only at crucial junctures and always low resolution. Much of the detailed work goes on unconsciously, while consciousness plays a coordinating role. I've long argued that if you stay on the introspective surface, conscious surface, free will is going to look like a mystery, as it has appeared to be to so many thinkers down through the centuries. Since Freud, the unconscious has seemed the enemy of free will, but it is, I think, a necessary ingredient. That said, I'm going to shift gears now and perhaps surprise you a bit by saying that even if one were to grant what has just been said thus far about conscious willing, a big if, the traditional problem of free will, the one of which Rumi spoke, would not by any means have been solved. We have still only scratched its surface. To see why, we need to return to those free will skeptics I told you about at the beginning, the ones who claimed in the spirit of Nietzsche that genuine free will of the kind that would confer true responsibility on humans is an illusion and an impossibility. Why do these skeptics think this? They think it because of a dilemma that has been discussed since ancient times, which goes like this. If free will is not compatible with determinism, it does not seem to be compatible with indeterminism either, and yet the two are contradictories. Determinism means, given the past, there is only one possible future, whereas indeterminism is the contradictory, given the past, there are multiple possible futures. Indeterminism implies a forking paths view of the future, in the words of Borges' famous story of a garden of forking paths, which is the way we often think about freedom to choose different courses of action. Indeterminism might seem, therefore, to be more congenial to free will, on the surface at least. So why do skeptics think that indeterminism presents just as much a problem for free will as determinism? The problem, they argue, is that indeterminism by itself amounts to mere chance or randomness. Events that are undetermined, such as certain behaviors of electrons and other elementary particles, according to modern quantum physics, on standard interpretations at least, occur by chance. How can chance events, say the skeptics, be free and responsible actions? Suppose a choice resulted from undetermined quantum events in the brain, assuming this could happen. Would that amount to a free and responsible choice? The resulting choice would seem to be something more like a fluke or an accident, like spinning a wheel in one's mind, with one outcome popping out by chance or randomly. Undetermined events in the brains and bodies, say the skeptics, would not enhance, but rather undermine our freedom and control over our actions. These thoughts, I think, have had a hypnotic effect on modern debates about free will, indeed on the whole history of the problem. As a result of them, defenders of an undetermined free will have looked for some deus ex machina to solve the problem, something to tip the balance that chance leaves untipped. And here I'm thinking of Patrick's Ghost in the Machine. But it's not only that image. There have been many others. Great thinkers of the modern era, from Descartes to Kant, and many lesser ones have postulated various extra factors to fill the causal gaps in nature that chance might leave unfilled. Indeterminism provides causal gaps in the natural order, they argued, but that is not enough for free will. Some other kind of agency or factor must fill those gaps, tipping the balance to one choice or another. A noumenal self or an immaterial mind, or a non-event cause or an uncaused cause, and so on. And to such suggestions of the philosophers, scientists have predictably cried mystery. A traditional incompatibilist free will, one that would require indeterminism, must, according to free will skeptics, reduce either to mere chance or to mystery. But that's only one half of the ancient free will skeptic's dilemma. If free will and moral agency aren't compatible with indeterminism, perhaps they are compatible with determinism after all. Many modern philosophers and scientists have, by such reasoning, come around to compatibilist views of free will by default almost. Free will, according to these compatibilist views, does not require indeterminism. It's perfectly compatible with determinism. But that brings us to the second half of the ancient dilemma. Why have so many thinkers down through the centuries thought free will was not compatible with determinism? I'll give you 3 clues. The first comes from Aristotle, who said that if the circumstances in which you act, including the character, decisions, and motives from which you act, determine your action, then to be responsible for the action, you must be responsible for at least some of the circumstances, such as your character, decisions, and motives, that led you to act as you did. This is no esoteric principle. It is woven into the fabric of our everyday reasoning about morality and responsibility. If a drunk driver kills a pedestrian, and it could be shown that given the circumstances, including the visibility on the road, the condition of his nervous system, given the alcohol, that he could not possibly have avoided hitting the pedestrian, that alone is not exonerating. One wants to know whether he is responsible for any of the prior conditions and circumstances that placed him in a position where he could not possibly have avoided hitting the pedestrian, such as his prior decisions to drink and drive, and so on. The second clue comes from a story, or involves a story. Imagine a young man on trial for an assault and robbery in which his victim was beaten to death. Let us say we attend his trial and listen to the evidence in the courtroom. At first, our thoughts of the young man are filled with anger and resentment at his vile act. But as we listen daily to how he came to have the mean character and perverse motives he did have, a sad story of parental neglect, child abuse, bad role models, and so on, some of our resentment against the young man is shifted over to the parents and others who abused and mistreated him. Notice how natural that reaction is. We begin to feel angry with them as well as with him. Yet we aren't quite ready to shift all of the moral blame away from the young man himself. We wonder whether some residual responsibility may not belong to him. Our questions become, to what extent is he responsible for becoming the sort of person he now is? Was it all a question of bad parenting, societal neglect, social conditioning, and the like, or did he have any role to play in it? These are crucial questions about free will, and they are questions about what may be called the young man's ultimate responsibility. We know that parenting and society, genetic makeup and upbringing have an enormous influence on what we become and what we are. But were these influences entirely determining, or did they leave anything over for us to be responsible for? That is what we want to know about the young man. The question of whether he is merely a victim of bad circumstances or has some residual responsibility for being what he is. The question, that is, of whether he became the person he is of his own free will seems to depend on whether those other factors were or were not entirely determining. This story tells us something else of importance about free will. There's been a tendency in the modern era from the 16th century onward to reduce the problem of free will to one of freedom of action. But freedom of will is not just about free action. It's about self-formation. How did we get to be the kinds of persons we are with the wills, characters, and motives we now have? Was it we ourselves who are responsible for forming our characters and motives, or someone or something else beyond our control, God or fate, heredity and environment, nature or upbringing, society or culture, etc.? Therein, I believe, lies the traditional problem of free will. The third clue comes from the meaning of determinism itself. Determinism means, as I said, that given the past and the laws of nature, there's only one possible future. That's a very strong doctrine. It implies that given the past and laws, any act a person performs at any time is the only act that could have been performed given the past and the laws. And so it would be of the young man. And the impossibility here is very strong, what the formal logicians call the modal system S5. In no logically possible world whatever can there be this past, these laws, and any other act occurs but the one that actually did occur. It can be shown that this is the traditional doctrine of determinism that has worried philosophers for centuries, whether in logical, religious, or scientific forms. And it's a strong and worrisome doctrine, as one can see by considering what Israeli philosopher David Weidecker has called the W defense. If persons are accused of having done something wrong, they may ask, "What would you have had me do instead?" And suppose in the circumstances there is nothing else they could have done. Is this exonerating? Not necessarily, for they may be responsible by virtue of prior actions for putting themselves in these circumstances where there is now nothing they could have done. Thus, we may invoke the Aristotelian principle, which, as I said, is woven into the fabric of our ordinary reasoning. The problem is that, if determinism is true, there is nothing else they could have ever done differently in their entire lifetimes to make themselves or their circumstances any different than they are. Now, those who believe free will is compatible with determinism in the modern era from Hobbes and Locke onward have invoked a common strategy for avoiding this problem. All we mean when we say persons could have done otherwise, they argue, is that they would have done otherwise if the past had been different in some way. If the persons had had different beliefs or desires or reasoned or chosen differently, they would have acted differently. But this strategy is deeply flawed. Immanuel Kant aptly called it a wretched subterfuge. Some here may disagree, but I agree with Kant. And William James called it a quagmire of evasion. Many objections can be made against it, and even many prominent compatibilists today reject it. It may be true that persons would have done otherwise if the past had been different in some way. But the past was not different in some way. It was as it was. Our freedom and responsibility must be exercised in the world that actually is, not in some hypothetical world that never was. A second strategy common to more recent compatibilists is simply to deny that moral responsibility for actions requires that we could have done otherwise at all. This strategy is more subtle but also unsatisfactory, I think. For it is true that we can be held responsible for many actions, even though we could not have done otherwise, and even if the actions were determined by our then existing characters and motives. Often we act from a will already formed, but it is our own free will by virtue of the fact that we formed it by choices and actions in the past for which we could have done otherwise. If that were not so, there's nothing we could have ever done differently in our entire lifetimes to make ourselves different than we are. A consequence, I believe, that's incompatible with being responsible for being the way we are. Now, I think these arguments for the incompatibility of free will and determinism are very powerful. But the other horn of the free will skeptic's dilemma is equally powerful. Must an undetermined free will reduce to either chance or to mystery? That's the question. I asked myself that question 40 years ago and have been wrestling with it ever since. And I'm now going to suggest to you how one might go about answering it, though I can only give a fragment of the story in the time allotted. First, let us be clear that it's an empirical and scientific question whether any indeterminism or randomness is there in nature in ways that are appropriate for free will, in the brain, for example. It may very well not be there. And in any case, no purely philosophical theory can settle the matter. And yet, philosophical reasoning is relevant to many aspects of the free will problem. And our present question is the philosophical one that has boggled people's minds for centuries. What could one do with indeterminism, assuming it was available, say in the form of random neural noise that was not entirely damped out, to make sense of free will as something other than mere chance or randomness? Patrick, in his paper, mentioned some studies by other researchers suggesting that random neural noise, not this paper today, but another one that I read of Patrick's earlier, suggesting by other researchers suggesting that random neural noise might play a role in action selection. And biologist Martin Heisenberg, son of the famous physicist, in a much discussed recent paper in Nature in 2009, has made similar claims about action selection in lower organisms. But is it not hopelessly muddled or incoherent to think one could do something with random neural noise to make sense of distinctively human responsible free will as something other than mere chance or mystery? Perhaps it is. But here's an exercise in how one might think about the matter differently, and therefore how to think about free will without having to introduce mystery or mere chance. The first step is to note that indeterminism would not have to be involved in all acts of our own free wills for which we are ultimately responsible. Many such acts may flow determinately from a will already formed. Not all such acts have to be undetermined, but only those by which we made ourselves into the kinds of persons we are. I call these self-forming actions, or SFAs. And I believe these undetermined self-forming actions, if they occur at all, would occur at those difficult times in life when we are torn between competing visions of what we should do and become. Perhaps we're torn between doing the moral thing or acting from ambition, or between powerful present desires and long-term goals, or we are faced with difficult tasks for which we have aversions. In all such cases, we are faced with competing motivations and have to make an effort to overcome temptation to do something else we also strongly want to do. There's a tension and uncertainty in our minds about what to do at such times, I suggest, that may be reflected in appropriate regions of our brains, a kind of stirring up of chaos in the brain that would make it sensitive to micro-indeterminacies at the neuronal level. The uncertainty and inner tension we would feel at such soul-searching moments of self-formation would thus be reflected in the indeterminacy of our neural processes themselves. What is experienced internally as uncertainty would correspond physically to an opening of a window of opportunity that would temporarily screen off complete determination by influences of the past. By contrast, when we're not torn in this way about what to do, but are acting from predominant motives, settled routines of the sort that both Michael and Patrick have talked about, the indeterminacy would be muted and not amplified on this hypothesis. If we did decide under such conditions of uncertainty, the outcome would not be determined because of the preceding indeterminacy. And yet it could be willed and hence rational and voluntary either way, owing to the fact that in such self-formation, the agent's prior wills are divided by conflicting motives. Consider a businesswoman who faces such a conflict. She's on her way to an important meeting when she observes an assault taking place in an alley. An inner struggle ensues between her conscience to stop and call for help and her career ambitions, which tell her she cannot miss this meeting. She has to make an effort of will to overcome the temptation to go on. If she overcomes this temptation, it will be the result of her effort. But if she fails, it will be because she did not allow her effort to succeed. And this is due to the fact that while she willed to overcome temptation, she also willed to fail for quite different and incommensurable reasons. When we, like the woman, decide in such circumstances, and the indeterminate efforts we are making become determinate choices, we would make one set of competing reasons or motives prevail over the others, then and there, by deciding. Now add a further piece to this puzzle. Just as indeterminism need not undermine rationality and voluntariness, so it need not of itself undermine control and responsibility. Suppose you're trying to think through a difficult problem, say a mathematical problem, and there's some indeterminacy in your neural processes, complicating the task. It'd be like trying to concentrate and solve a problem with background noise or distraction. Whether you're going to succeed is uncertain and undetermined because of the distracting neural noise. Yet if you concentrate and solve the problem nonetheless, there's reason to say you did it and are responsible for it, even though it was undetermined whether you would succeed. The indeterministic noise would have been an obstacle that you overcame by your effort. There are numerous examples supporting this point where indeterminism functions as an obstacle to success without precluding responsibility. The assassin mentioned earlier is a case in point. He might miss his target because of some undetermined events in his nervous system that may lead to a wavering of his arm, but if he succeeds, nevertheless, he's responsible. Though his action killing the prime minister would have been literally undetermined. Or consider a husband who, while arguing with his wife in a fit of rage, swings his arm down on her favorite glass tabletop, intending to break it. Again, we suppose that some indeterminism in his outgoing neural pathways makes the momentum of his arm indeterminate, so that it's genuinely undetermined whether the table will break right up to the moment when it is struck. Whether the husband breaks the table or not is undetermined, and yet he's clearly responsible if he does break it. It would be a poor excuse for him to say to his wife, "Chance did it, not me." The trick here, then, is not to think of indeterminism that might be involved in free choices as a cause acting on its own, but as an ingredient in some larger goal-directed or teleological process or activity in which the indeterminism functions as a hindrance or an obstacle to the attainment of the goal. Such is the role envisaged for indeterminism in the efforts leading to self-forming choices. We tend to reason, for example, that if the outcome of an action, whether it's breaking a table in the husband's case or making a choice in the businesswoman's, depends on whether certain neurons fire or not in the arm or the brain, then the agent must be able to make those neurons fire or not if the agent is to be held responsible for the outcome. In other words, we think we have to crawl down to the place where the indeterminism originates in the individual neurons and make them go one way or another. We think we have to become originators at the micro level and tip the balance that chance leaves untipped. If we, and not chance, are to be responsible for the outcome. And this sends philosophers around scurrying to find some deus ex machina, as I said, to do the trick. But we don't have to do that. It's the wrong place to look. We don't have to micromanage our individual neurons to perform purposive actions, and we do not have such micro-control over our neurons even when we perform ordinary actions, such as swinging an arm down on a table and so on. There is one other thing that would be needed, I believe, to make this picture work. And it also, as it happens, something we learned from contemporary neuroscience. I can only briefly mention it here. Michael mentioned it in part during his talk, in the time allotted. Much neuroscientific evidence points to the fact that the brain is a parallel processor. And this is what I said Michael had mentioned and discussed briefly. It simultaneously processes different kinds of information relevant to tasks such as visual perception through different neural pathways or streams. Such a capacity, I believe, is essential to the exercise of free will. The theme here again is that if you look merely on the surface at what we consciously introspect in free action and deliberation, free will is likely to appear a mystery, as it has so often throughout history. One has to look below the introspective surface to what may be going on behind the scenes to make sense of it. If parallel distributive processing takes place on the input side of the cognitive ledger in perception and recognition, as most assume now that it does, then perhaps it takes place on the output side as well in deliberation and decision making. In cases of self-formation, SFAs, on the above account of it, I suggest that agents would be simultaneously trying to resolve plural and competing cognitive tasks. They would be, as we say, think of the businesswoman here, they would be, as we say, of two minds, yet not two separate persons. They would not be dissociated from either task. The businesswoman who wants to go back to help the victim is the same ambitious woman who wants to go to her meeting and make a sale. She's torn inside by different visions of who she is and who she wants to be, as we all are from time to time. But this is the kind of complexity needed for genuine self-formation and free will. And when she succeeds in attaining the goal of one of these cognitive processes, she will endorse that as the resolution of the conflict in her will and hence be responsible for it. I conclude with one final issue here. Even if one granted that persons such as the businesswoman could make genuine self-forming choices that were undetermined in this manner, isn't there something to the charge that such choices would be arbitrary? A residual arbitrariness would seem to remain in all self-forming choices, since the agents cannot in principle have sufficient or conclusive prior reasons for making one option or one set of reasons prevail over the other. This is again one of those truths, I believe, that tell us something important about free will. In this case, it tells us that every self-forming free choice would be the initiation of what might be called a value experiment, whose justification lies in the future and is not fully explained by past reasons. Here we might bring in Patrick's idea of the predictive activity of intentions. In making such a choice, we say, in effect, let's try this. It's not required by my past, but it is consistent with my past and is one branching pathway my life can now meaningfully take. Whether it's the right choice, only time will tell. Meanwhile, I am willing to take responsibility for it one way or the other. The term arbitrary, as I have often noted in my writings, comes from the Latin arbitrium, which means judgment, as in the medieval phrase, liberum arbitrium voluntatis, free judgment of the will, which was the medieval philosopher's designation for free will. Imagine a writer in the middle of a novel. And here I'm going to make contact with Michael's discussion of the interpreter and the story maker. Imagine a writer in the middle of a novel. The novel's heroine faces a crisis, and the writer has not yet developed her character in sufficient detail to say exactly how she will act. The author of the novel makes a judgment about this that is not determined by the heroine's already formed past, which does not give unique direction. In this sense, the judgment, arbitrium, of how she will react is arbitrary, but not entirely so. It had input from the heroine's fictional past and in turn gave input to her projected future. In a similar way, agents who exercise free will, I suggest, are both authors of and characters in their own stories all at once. By virtue of self-forming judgments of the will, arbitria voluntatis, or what I call SFAs, self-forming actions, they are arbiters of their own lives, making themselves out of a past that, if they are truly free, does not limit their future pathways to one. Suppose we were to say to such persons, "But look, you didn't have sufficient or conclusive prior reasons for choosing as you did, since you also had viable reasons for choosing the other way." They might reply as follows: "True enough, but I did have good reasons for choosing as I did, which I'm willing to stand by and take responsibility for. If these reasons were not sufficient or conclusive reasons, that's because, like the heroine of the novel, I was not a fully formed person before I chose, and still am not, for that matter. Like the author of the novel, I am in the process of writing an unfinished story and forming an unfinished character who, in my case, is myself." Thank you. Can we get some?
Thank you, Bob, for a wonderful and very thought-provoking talk. What I'd like to do is open it up for a few questions directly about Bob's talk, and then Patrick, if you could come up, and we'll have a 15-minute discussion from both talks.
Is it on?
Dorsey.
Oh, yes.
I had the good fortune of having been Bob Kane's classmate.
Yes, indeed.
1960. And in 1961, as a Dartmouth medical student, wrote a paper about the unconscious and free will.
And I have read it.
Yeah. It is interesting that Bob mentioned, but only briefly, Sigmund Freud. It is just 100 years ago, almost to the day, that he made his only appearance in the United States at Clark University. And while from the church's point of view, his atheism and view that religion is the opiate of the masses made him persona non grata, I don't think that should be allowed to stand in the way of understanding that the whole understanding we have clinically about the unconscious came out of his private practice of psychoanalysis. And the work that he did to help patients become aware of the emotional energy that they were using to repress all those terrible unconscious thoughts, seen in Oedipus Rex and seen in Hamlet, he's had a profound effect. So I'm going to read just one paragraph.
I'm sorry, could I ask you to get to a question,
This will be quick.
please?
We may insist as much as we like that the human intellect is weak in comparison with human instincts, and be right in doing so. But nevertheless, there's something peculiar about this weakness. The voice of the intellect is a soft one, but it does not rest until it's gained a hearing. Ultimately, after endlessly repeated rebuffs, it succeeds. This is one of the few points in which one may be optimistic about the future of mankind, but in itself, it signifies not a little.
I would add to that there isn't much time, so I was going to go ahead. Yeah.
Hello. Just one quick comment. when people talk about, the question of deterministic and non-deterministic, no, I think, it's not a either or. We could have both, just like, nature versus nurture. No modern scientist would just, lean on one side and exclude the other. If you pick the, your topic, from the, computational neurological model as a neuroscientist, and, the track, like your perception of visions, and they already deterministic because you have to go through the track, the optic track, either you go ipsilateral or contralateral. But on the same event, at the higher, cortical functions, you can exercise, choice. And you have so many alternatives. The reason is the built-in system we call biological redundancy. The Brandeis University, they can use 2 receptors and account the whole system of the neuropathic pain. I think the same thing is said for free will, moral responsibility. We have a given, default system, plus on top of it, I would say is a fair, treatment that we have a free choice and free options.
Right. Well, there would certainly have to be a mixture of determinate behavior and possibly some random behavior. There would have to be something of both. And another thing, by the way, that many people don't make a distinction about in this area is the distinction between causation and determinism. They often define determinism as every event is caused, but all events can be caused and not all be determined. There's non-deterministic forms of causation. So that the scientific picture will demand that everything have a cause or be caused. But that doesn't mean necessarily that it has to be determined.
So this is a question I'm sure you've heard many times before, but I'm curious to hear your answer. I find your view compelling in many ways, and I think it's an elegant picture that marries a lot of the advantages and disadvantages of usually rival views about free will. The place where I get stuck is with when it comes to punishment and desert. So you imagine the case, the person holding the trigger, do you kill that person out of anger? And suppose that while there are these volitional competing desires, so on and so forth, what ends up tipping the balance for version A is the noise going one way rather than the other way. And if the noise goes one way, we say you deserve to go to prison for 20 years or whatever it is. And if it doesn't, we say you almost did something terrible, but you deserve a lot less or nothing at all. How do you...
Right. This is a standard and very deep objection. It sometimes go by the name the luck objection, and there are about 14 variations of it. It's a very difficult, perhaps the most difficult one to deal with. The way I deal with it is suggested in this paper, but not in complete detail. And that is with the idea that notice, that's why I used examples like the husband hitting the table and the assassin and so on, to show you that even though you could say what happens was the result of whether certain neurons fired in this way or that way, the person is still responsible. How can that be? That's astonishing. It's quite astonishing. How can that be? In the assassin case, for example, or the husband case, whether it broke it and so on, and they are still responsible. You have to put that indeterminism inside of a larger goal-directed activity so that if that activity succeeds despite the indeterminism, the person's responsible because they did it and their conscious oversight of it and their endorsement of the result makes them responsible. And even if there's some indeterminism in the neural system involved there, they are still responsible.
So, but do you want to send one to prison and the other not, is the question?
Well, they did it, you see. That's where I need the parallel processing. Some people did it this way, some people did it that way. The consequence is he did it. The husband broke the table. Chance didn't do it. Okay, so, another variation of this is roll back to the beginning of the universe and run this thing over many, many times. And let's say there was a probability it went one way and probability it went the other way. And that seems to suggest, well, it's just a matter of probability and so on. But I say each time the individual person has to make the choice themselves. And if you rolled me back and I made a different choice, I'd be responsible for that different choice. Okay?